The door was unlocked. Dugny Doris Hannelore, the housekeeper who worked for William Holden at his condominium at 535 Ocean Avenue in Santa Monica, California, arrived on the morning of November the 5th, 1981, to find the door of the apartment unlocked in a way that was unusual. Not the dramatic unlockedness of a door that has been forced or broken. The quiet unlockedness of a door that was simply not locked, which can mean many things and which in this case meant the thing it turned out to mean. She went in, she called his name. She moved through the apartment in the way of a person who is beginning to understand that what they are walking toward is not what they want to find. She found him in the bedroom. He was on the floor near the bed. He was wearing only shorts. There was blood. There was a great deal of blood, more than the circumstances that would eventually be established as the cause of it would seem, at first glance, to account for. The blood had come from a laceration on his forehead, a cut approximately 1 inch long above his right eyebrow, consistent with the edge of the nightstand beside the bed. He had hit his head on the nightstand. He had been bleeding. He had not gotten up. She called the police. The police arrived at approximately 11 o'clock in the morning. The medical examiner arrived. The investigation that followed was brief because the apartment told a story that the investigators could read without requiring additional information. There was an empty bottle of Scotch whiskey on the counter. The blood alcohol level that the autopsy would subsequently determine was 0.22, which is nearly 3 times the legal limit for operating a motor vehicle, and which is, in a man of 63 with a body that had been absorbing large quantities of alcohol for decades, a level that produces in the body a specific kind of impairment. The impairment of a man who is too drunk to manage the fall that the alcohol has made inevitable. He had stumbled. He had hit his head. He had lain on the floor of his bedroom, bleeding from the laceration, for a period of time that the medical examiner estimated at between 3 and 4 days. The blood had dried. The body was in the state that a body enters after several days without intervention. The housekeeper had not been there for several days because she was not scheduled for several days, and there was nobody else who had been there because there was nobody else. He had been alone. He had been alone for 3 or 4 days, bleeding on the floor of his bedroom, in the apartment in Santa Monica, and nobody had come. This is the fact that I want you to hold at the beginning of this story, my friend, because it is the fact that the story of William Holden's death keeps returning to in the accounts of the people who knew him and who have spoken about him in the years since, and because it is the fact that illuminates, more than any single biographical detail, the shape of what his life had been and what the life had produced in the years before that November morning. He had been alone for 3 or 4 days, and nobody had come. Tonight, I want to tell you the whole story. Not only the story of the morning that the housekeeper found him, though that morning is where the story ends and where the questions begin. The full story. The story of where William Holden came from and what the industry made of him and what the making cost and what the decades of the cost produced and why, on a November morning in 1981, one of the most celebrated actors in the history of Hollywood was lying alone on the floor of a condominium in Santa Monica with nobody coming. Come with me. We are going back to O'Fallon, Illinois in the year 1918, to a family that was comfortable in the specific middle-class way of families that have enough and that have organized their enough into a life of stable, unremarkable provision. William Franklin Beadle Jr. was born on the 17th of April, 1918, in O'Fallon, Illinois. His father was William Franklin Beadle Sr., an industrial chemist whose work was respectable and whose income was sufficient and whose relationship to his son was the relationship of a man of his generation and his professional class to a son, present, providing, and not particularly given to the expression of the warmer registers of feeling. His mother was Mary Blanche Ball Beadle, a piano teacher whose artistic inclinations had been redirected by the circumstances of marriage and motherhood from their originally intended object toward the provision of musical education to other people's children. The family moved to California when he was young, to South Pasadena, and the move defined everything that followed because South Pasadena in the late 1920s and the 1930s was close enough to Hollywood that the industry was an available option, and far enough from it that arriving in it required a specific decision rather than simply being born into it. He was not planning on the acting. He was studying chemistry at Pasadena Junior College in the direction that his father's professional life had pointed, when an accident of calendar and proximity intervened. He was taking a radio workshop class at the Pasadena Playhouse in 1937 as an adjunct to the chemistry studies rather than as a professional ambition when a talent scout from Paramount Pictures came through the Playhouse and saw him. The scout saw what talent scouts see in the rare instances when what they are looking at is the real thing, a quality of physical presence combined with a quality of natural ease in front of an audience that the camera would translate into something commercially significant. He was 19 years old and he had the specific combination of dark good looks and an apparent effortlessness of manner that Paramount's commercial instincts identified immediately as bankable. He was screen tested. He was signed. He was renamed William Holden, a name chosen by the studio that was less chemical than William Beetle and more suitable for the marquee. He was 19 years old and he was under contract to Paramount Pictures, and he had not entirely planned any of it. His first significant film came quickly. Golden Boy in 1939, directed by Ruben Mamoulian, in which he played Joe Bonaparte, the young man torn between his gifts as a violinist and his ability as a boxer, the specific dramatic conflict of a person caught between the beautiful thing and the commercial thing, between what he loves and what pays. He was 21 years old, and the role required from him a quality of genuine emotional engagement with material that was, in its central conflict, closer to his own situation than the biographical distance might suggest. Paramount had him and did not entirely know what to do with him. He was put into a series of films through the late 1930s and into the 1940s that were not always worthy of him, and that he was not always entirely worthy of, in the specific way of a young actor who has the talent but has not yet found the form that the talent requires to be fully expressed. He served in the Army Air Forces during the Second World War. He was stationed in the United States for much of the war, making training films rather than seeing combat, and the war years were not the transformative military experience that some of his contemporaries underwent, but they were years of absence from the industry that had claimed him at 19, years in which he was required to exist as William Beetle rather than William Holden, and the requirement had consequences that the subsequent career reflected. He came back from the war in 1945 and resumed the career. The career resumed with the specific quality of a career that has been interrupted. The momentum of the pre-war period was gone, and the rebuilding of it required the kind of sustained professional effort that produces, in the people who sustain it, a quality of weary professionalism that was visible in his work of the late 1940s. And then Billy Wilder found him. Sunset Boulevard in 1950. Wilder directed it from a screenplay he wrote with Charles Brackett, and the film was about a faded silent film star and the young screenwriter she hires and what the relationship between them produces. William Holden played Joe Gillis, the screenwriter. Gloria Swanson played Norma Desmond, the faded star. Erich von Stroheim played Max, the butler. The film begins with Joe Gillis floating dead in a swimming pool, narrating his own story in flashback, which is one of the most brilliant structural decisions in the history of American screenwriting. What Holden gave Joe Gillis was the specific quality that the role required and that his career had been building toward without his knowing it was building toward it. The quality of a man who has compromised himself for money and comfort and who understands with uncomfortable clarity exactly what the compromise has cost him and continues to cost him, and that he is going to keep paying anyway. because the alternative is the version of himself that is less comfortable. And he is not, at this point in his life, willing to be that version. It was not a stretch. The connection between William Holden, the person, and Joe Gillis, the character, is one of the most precisely calibrated pieces of casting in a film full of precisely calibrated casting decisions. And it produced a performance of a quality that the subsequent career confirmed was not an accident, but the true expression of what William Holden was capable of when the material gave him the specific kind of access to his own interior life that Sunset Boulevard gave him. He was nominated for the Academy Award for Best Actor. He did not win for Sunset Boulevard. He won, 3 years later, for Stalag 17, which is a better film than its reputation and a better performance than Sunset Boulevard in the specific technical sense, though Sunset Boulevard remains the film that most completely captures what he was. The Oscar was received and celebrated, and the career continued to accelerate in the way of careers that the Academy has endorsed, and the acceleration produced the films of the 1950s that constitute the peak of what he was commercially and artistically. Picnic in 1955. Love is a many-splendored thing in 1955. The Bridge on the River Kwai in 1957, for which he would receive another Academy Award nomination. The Towering Inferno and Network, and the films of the 1970s that demonstrated, for audiences who had missed the 1950s peak, that the actor who had made those films was still fully present and still capable of the quality of work that the films of his peak had established. What the public version of the career does not show, because the public version of careers is organized around the professional achievements rather than the interior conditions of the person achieving them, is what the same years contained in the private version. He drank. He had been drinking seriously since before the film career began, in the way of some people for whom alcohol is not a social habit, but an interior necessity, a mechanism for managing the gap between the self that is required for public consumption and the self that exists in the private room, where the public consumption stops. He drank during production, which required the people working with him to manage the production around the drinking in ways that were not always simple. He drank between productions, which required the people who cared about him to manage his life around the drinking in ways that were not always possible. The marriage to Brenda Marshall in 1941 lasted 30 years, until 1971, and the 30 years contained, by the accounts of the people who were close to both parties, a sustained experience of the specific domestic reality that living with a serious alcoholic produces, the management, the accommodation, the periods of relative stability that the disease allows, and that the people around the alcoholic use to rebuild the hope that the next period of relative stability will be the one that holds, and the periods of the drinking's return that destroy the rebuilt hope and require it to be rebuilt again. He was not, in the marriage, the version of William Holden that the public knew. The public version, the charm, the ease, the specific quality of accessible warmth that the camera found in him and that audiences responded to with the loyalty that genuine warmth generates, was real, in the sense that the qualities were genuinely his and were not manufactured by the studio or by the professional apparatus. But the private version, the version that the marriage contained, included the alcoholism and what the alcoholism produced in a person who was living inside it, which was the specific combination of self-awareness and inability to act on the self-awareness that constitutes the alcoholic's most characteristic and most painful condition. He knew what the drinking was doing. He was not a man without intelligence, and the intelligence was applied to the drinking with the same uncomfortable clarity that Joe Gillis applied to his own compromise in Sunset Boulevard. He knew. He continued anyway. The marriage ended in 1971. The ending was not dramatic in the sense of a single event that precipitated it, but cumulative in the way that the endings of long marriages tend to be cumulative. The accumulation of decades of the specific difficulty that the drinking produced, arriving finally at the point where the accumulation exceeded the capacity of either party to sustain what the accumulation required. He did not remarry. He had a series of relationships in the years following the divorce with Stephanie Powers, whom he met in 1975, and with whom he built something that was, by the accounts of both parties in subsequent years, genuine and mutually important. Organized partly around the wildlife conservation work that he had been involved with in Africa since the 1960s, and that had become, in the years of its development into the Mount Kenya Game Ranch, one of the central organizing purposes of his life, alongside and eventually somewhat beyond the film work. The Mount Kenya Game Ranch was the thing he had built that he believed in most completely. In the way that a person believes in the thing they have built with their own resources in the service of something they genuinely care about, rather than in the service of an industry's commercial purposes. He had established it in 1959. He had spent 20 years building it into one of the most significant private wildlife conservation operations in East Africa. He had brought money from the film career to it, and time from the film career to it, and the specific quality of personal commitment that distinguishes the things a person does because they believe in them from the things they do because they are paid to. Stephanie Powers has said, in the years since his death, that the conservation work was the truest expression of who he was. She has said this with the specificity of someone who observed it directly, who was with him in Kenya, and who saw what the work required from him and what he gave to it and what it gave back. She has said that the man who existed in Africa, in the context of the conservation work, was more fully himself than the man who existed in Hollywood, which is the kind of statement that is easy to say, and that she said with enough specific detail to make clear that she meant it precisely. The relationship with Powers ended in 1981. The accounts of how and why it ended are not entirely consistent across the various sources, because relationships that end are described differently by the people who have ended them depending on what the ending cost each of them and what they are willing to say about the cost. What is consistent is that it ended, and that the ending was, for him, a loss of a specific dimension that the subsequent months made visible. He was, in the autumn of 1981, in the specific situation of a man who is 63 years old and who has lost the primary relationship of his late middle age and who is managing the loss in the way that he has always managed the things that are difficult, which was with alcohol. He was drinking more than he had been drinking in the years of the relationship with Powers, when the relationship had provided some of the specific conditions that make the management of alcoholism possible. The presence of another person who notices and who cares. The external structure that the relationship provides. The specific accountability that being known by someone you value creates. The accountability was gone. The structure was gone. The apartment in Santa Monica was the apartment of a man who was alone and who was drinking in the specific way of a person who has run out of reasons to manage the drinking. The night of November, the 1st or the 2nd, the precise date was not established by the subsequent investigation because the investigation could not establish when exactly the fall occurred. Only the range of days that the state of the body was consistent with. He was alone in the apartment. He had been drinking. He stumbled. He fell. He hit his head on the nightstand. He did not get up. The cut on his forehead was not, by itself, immediately fatal. It was a laceration, significant, bleeding freely, but not the kind of wound that produces immediate incapacitation in a person who is conscious and capable of responding to it. What produced the incapacitation was the combination of the wound and the blood alcohol level, which was 0.22. A man at 0.22 does not respond normally to physical injury. A man at 0.22 may lose consciousness, or may be capable only of a reduced and limited response to the crisis his body is in, or may be in a state where the bleeding from the wound does not produce the alarm that the same bleeding would produce in a man who was sober. He lay on the floor. He bled. Nobody came. The investigation that followed was brief because the evidence was not ambiguous in the way that ambiguous investigations require. The cause of death was accidental, the product of a fall sustained while intoxicated that produced a laceration whose bleeding, combined with the blood alcohol level, produced incapacitation and eventually death. There was no evidence of another person in the apartment. There was no evidence of foul play. There was a bottle of Scotch and a nightstand and a body and 3 or 4 days during which nobody had come. The Los Angeles County coroner released the findings in November of 1981. The findings were received by the entertainment press with the specific quality of coverage that celebrity deaths from alcohol-related causes receive. Sympathetic but uncomfortable, honoring the career while noting the manner of the death with the delicacy that manner requires, and that sometimes produces accounts that are more careful about the delicacy than about the truth. The truth was that William Holden had been found alone on his bedroom floor after 3 or 4 days, and that the 3 or 4 days during which nobody had come was the most revealing fact about the shape of his life in its final period. Not because nobody cared, the people who knew him well cared deeply, and the grief that the death produced in those people was genuine and was not small. But because the caring in the final period of his life had not produced the presence that would have made the difference. The conservation work continued after his death. Stephanie Powers, who had been central to the Mount Kenya Game Ranch alongside him, continued the work with the William Holden Wildlife Foundation, which she established in his memory and which remains active. The thing he built with the resources of the career he was ambivalent about, in the service of the cause he was unambivalent about, outlasted him in a form that was more durable than the career itself. The films remain. Sunset Boulevard remains. Stalag 17 remains. Network, and Picnic, and The Wild Bunch, and Bridge on the River Kwai, and the full range of what a career of exceptional quality produced across 4 decades. And the housekeeper's memory of that November morning in 1981 remains, in the specific way that the memories of witnesses to things that should not have happened remain. Not as something that fades with time, but as something that does not quite fade, that stays in the specific category of things that are seen, and that the seeing of them cannot undo. She found him. She called the police. The police came. But nobody came in time. Now, my friend, I want to sit with you for a moment in the meaning of that, because the meaning is not simple and does not resolve into a clean lesson and requires something from the person receiving it that clean lessons do not require. William Holden was one of the finest actors of the 20th century. He gave the films what the films required for 4 decades, with the consistency of a professional who understood what he was doing and who did it at a level of quality that the people who directed him consistently described as one of the most reliable gifts they had encountered. He was not perfect. He was not the man the public thought they knew, which is true of virtually everyone the public thinks they know, and which in his case was specifically true in ways that the alcoholism made visible to the people who were close enough to see it. He was also a man who had built something real in Africa, something that had nothing to do with the industry that had named him and paid him and used him for 40 years. Something that was his in the way that only the things you build outside the context of what people are paying you to build can be entirely yours. He carried the drinking for 60 years, from before the career began until the morning the housekeeper found him. He carried it in the way of people who carry such things, not invisibly, not without the people around him seeing it, but without putting it down. Without finding, across 60 years of trying various forms of help and various periods of relative sobriety, the thing that would allow the putting it down to hold. He died on a floor in Santa Monica, alone with a bottle of Scotch on the counter and nobody there. He deserved to have someone there, not because he was famous, and not because of the films, and not because of what he had built in Africa, but because nobody deserves to be alone on a floor for 3 or 4 days, and because the specific loneliness of that, the 3 or 4 days of nobody coming, is the truest and saddest thing about the end of a life that had contained more than the industry ever fully acknowledged. Sleep well, my friend. And the next time you see Joe Gillis floating in that swimming pool at the beginning of Sunset Boulevard, narrating his own death in the specific voice of a man who knows exactly what happened and why, and who has decided to tell the truth about it, even though the telling cannot change it, hear what is in that voice. You are hearing William Holden 31 years before the housekeeper found him. He knew then what it was to be alone with what you know. He knew it still, at the end.